Hello, Free Speech and the Challenge of Social Media students. Dr. Conway here for Lesson 12, the final lecture video of our term. Last week we discussed some theoretical aspects or some definitional aspects of regulation. Today we're going to be talking about trying to look at regulation in practice and what are some of the issues that are involved. We know that through our course we've come to the point of knowing that free speech is vitally important to a liberal democracy, but that what we're seeing on social media may not be the free speech that we always we were talking about earlier in the term. We were talking about the proliferation of hate speech, misinformation, disinformation, bullying, and so on social media. But more importantly, from a free speech perspective, we ask the question, is free speech really what we're getting on social media today with viral marketing algorithms and with cookies and with siloing and information bubbling of people by design, right? So that we weren't seeing the proposition of the marketplace of ideas that John Stuart Mill talked about, were we? We were seeing something else. But we are also very sensitive to the fact that free speech is very important. So any approach we take to addressing the problems that we're seeing that are associated with social media, and we've perhaps never seen the problems so severe as they are right now, given the U.S. election and given COVID-19 and so on, and conspiracy theories and so on that are going on now, it's even more extensive, and it's likely to continue to be very, very extensive unless something is done. Question is, what do you do, and how do you do it in such a way that protects the vital importance of free speech to liberal democracy? And that's the difficult part, right? So let's continue on with our discussion a little bit here on what the different ways of addressing these problems would be could be approached, or what are the options for doing that, right? One of them is government regulation, right? The other is private regulation, and the other is social media education, right? But let's talk about these things as we go through, okay? Now, keep in mind, whenever regulation is being considered in any area, all right, by government, to address a harm, governments must look at what factors of harm must be regulated, okay, to achieve the desired harm reduction objectives. How would we approach social media regulation if government was to do it in a more serious way? What types of benefits can we expect from proposed regulation? There's no use doing it unless the benefits greatly exceed the risks or harms that could be caused, or the costs that could be incurred because of the regulations. In other words, benefits have to outweigh costs and risks, right? Or it wouldn't make sense, would it, right? And we know the risks of regulating speech are. We've discussed that in a free speech context, but we also know what the risks are and what the harms are of not regulating social media in terms of its distorting effects on free speech, right? In terms of truthfulness, facts, and so on, right? What parties are best targeted for regulation to achieve the desired harm reduction objectives? What level of costs and risks are likely to be associated with implementation of a regulation? Okay, and whether benefits outweigh the costs and risks, so vice versa, becomes a vital calculation for whether regulation will move forward or not, right? The factors of harm associated with unfettered social media we've discussed extensively in this course, right? And the elimination of these factors could result in significant social benefits, according to large numbers of experts and politicians and regulatory experts. Could help with the political cohesiveness and stability of our democracy, including defense of our free elections. We're seeing the role of conspiracy theories in challenging democracy right now in the United States, right? I mean, immensely harmful to democratic institutions, okay? The mental and social well-being of our citizens can be improved. There's ample data on the social psychological effects of social media, particularly amongst the young or those most vulnerable to things like radicalization, right? Protection of vulnerable groups and individuals exposed to hate speech and personal attacks. That goes everything from Black Lives Matters to indigenous peoples, to wildlife species, for hunting rights, to any number of different issues that emerge on social media to create an atmosphere of disrespect for people or the environment, or any number of the elderly, and so on. Okay, so we see these types of issues in social media cropping up all the time, right? And so, the protection of vulnerable groups obviously is going to be a priority of any government. Okay, any liberal democratic government, certainly. All right, so. And then constituencies that could, in theory, be the target of regulation include people and organizations who generate the content, right? That's one set of actors out there right now. I'm only talking about the set of actors that are out there. The people and organizations who put the content on social media. Could they be the subject of some control? Consumers of social media content. Should the social media users be under some control? Should there be limits on the age that you can use social media or whatever? These are possibilities. I'm going to dispel these first two fairly quickly, but there's are people involved in the social media equation, right? Corporations that host speech on their social media platforms is another approach that can be taken by any government regulatory body, okay? But the important thing to remember is that regulation tends to work best when regulated parties are relatively homogeneous in the factors of harm being regulated and manageable in terms of the number of regulated parties. Regulations don't work that well when we're dealing with highly diverse and numerous populations residing in a wide range of unique circumstances, right? There's different policy approaches that are best used for that, right? Regulation is not the greatest for that, right? People and organizations who generate content, this is a massive group, right? This is a very diverse, numerous category measured in the millions that can range from those who advertise products and services to research and education institutions, legitimate news organizations, to organizations of people that foster misinformation or develop disinformation and hate speech. The range is enormous, and we've seen that people's ability to put content on social media can be very important to liberal democracy, right? It can raise awareness about things like indigenous rights and about Black Lives Matter, about ecosystem and environmental protection, about defending and protecting the elderly, all kinds of very positive social causes. So we wouldn't want to mitigate that, right? We would want to ensure that continues to thrive in a medium such as social media, right? But the question then becomes, well, how do we eliminate the stuff that is, purposefully designed to do harm, which disinformation and hate speech is purposefully designed to do harm, okay? So, and even more so, the consumers of social media content are measured in the billions around the world, and millions in Canada alone, who are as diverse as life itself, right? So clearly that's not a great target for any kind of regulation, right? Digital 2020 Global Overview Report, which is cited in this slide, contends that there are more than 4.5 billion people now using the internet around the world, and social media users have passed the 3.8 billion person mark, which is clearly the most amazing communication medium that humanity has ever invented, right? Statista estimates that there were approximately 25 million social media users in Canada in 2018, and that is projected to grow to 27.1 million in 2023. Obviously, given our population size, that's a lot of young people using social media every day for potentially hours a day, okay? By contrast with these first two sort of possible targets of regulation, corporations that host speech on their social media platforms are few in number and tend to be highly homogeneous in the way they operate. That makes them clearly the target for most government regulation, right? Not the first two category of actors. The vast majority of social media users in democratic countries are captured by 9 prominent social media platforms. Right? That's changing a bit now with the rapid rise of TikTok, but mainly Facebook, YouTube, WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, Instagram, Reddit, Snapchat, Twitter, and Pinterest are the big guys, right? The largest remaining ones have primarily been developed behind China's internet firewall, although like TikTok, some of them are starting to emerge in other countries and become very powerful, are popular, and that will continue to change. There will be others, right? Others will emerge in time, all right? And social media corporations also generate large profits from their platforms, as we've discussed before, right? And business models, and it can afford to absorb the cost of regulatory compliance. Regulation of these entities can be much more focused and cost-effective for compliance, promotion, and enforcement activities. This is why governments have to date focused and will continue to focus regulatory efforts on the social media companies or corporations themselves, okay, for the reasons I've described. Okay, risks and complexities of regulating social media. We can never forget that, right? Because if there's a couple of core things we've learned in this course is that free speech is vitally important to liberal democracy. On the other hand, we're also seeing a case of we're not really getting free speech as we understand it in the new social media context. And we're getting basically avenues for harm through disinformation, hate speech, misinformation, and so on. All right? And this is the question that we're dealing with. Not free speech. We're dealing with the question of these purposefully harm-causing and free speech abusing activities. All right? Because free speech, if it's to be meaningful for liberal democracy, has to be based to a degree, at least a substantial degree, on facts and truthfulness, not myths, lies, purposeful conspiracy theories, disinformation, and so on, which we know is not doing anybody any good, right? Those things are designed to achieve other purposes entirely that are not necessarily consistent with or even supportive of free speech. Conspiracy theories that promote neo-fascist activities and racist activities and so on are clearly nothing about freedom, right? They're about something else. But they're using the moniker of free speech to do harmful things on the social media context. And there's no use denying that. There's no use stepping back from that reality. We can still be strong advocates for free speech and realize that some of this is just abuse of free speech within a social media infrastructure that fosters siloing and bubbling and extremism. Okay? So there's nothing wrong. There's nothing inconsistent with supporting free speech and protecting people from harmful activity on social media. All right, so don't buy into that dichotomy because it's a false dichotomy. All right, and those three communities of social media: the producers of content, the users of content, and the industry itself, or the corporations themselves. You can't regulate all of those parties. It would be almost impossible in a democracy. You would need an internet firewall to do that, much like what China, Russia, Belarus would approach it, right? But unlike in authoritarian countries, we would never approach it that way because we have constitutional protections from free speech and because we know the value of free speech. And free speech is exactly what we're trying to defend by getting at this social media abuses, right? And it's important to not be fit into one of those dichotomies where because you want to control the harms on free speech, harms towards free speech and towards people on social media, you're somehow against free speech. We've learned, if anything, in this course that that's nonsense, right? That we can be strong advocates of free speech in a liberal democracy. In fact, such strong advocates that we want it to be, we want social media to stop being an abusive arena for and against, for basically things that will undercut free speech and the people's loyalty to free speech. Okay. And that's why most democratic countries that regulate social media do not approach it as a question of free speech regulation at all, but rather as commercial regulation to address a harm generally viewed as constitutional. Okay, corporations already take private commercial decisions to regulate the content that will be carried on their platforms, and that is not seen as a threat to free speech. Newspapers can't publish everything, right? They receive hundreds of letters from viewers that want to get their opinions published in the newspaper, and maybe one gets published a month or two get published a month. All right, and so lots of free speech is curtailed within existing media, traditional media in society today, right? A newspaper publishers must try to make a profit for their companies, and in pursuit of this objective, make editorial decisions daily as to what to publish and what will not be carried on their platform. All right? Just like they don't publish blatant conspiracy theories in legitimate traditional newspapers like the Globe and Mail, at Toronto Star, or whatever. Why should social media be so blatant, about publishing these things. So it's not like there are not parallels where we never argued about free speech, in the past when we had traditional media and television and so on. We might have argued that we weren't getting an adequate enough voice, but there were other ways to get voices. Social media has made it easier to get those voices, but it's also made it easier to abuse the rights of free speech. All right? So most democratic countries approach regulation of social media as commercial activity rather than regulating free speech itself. Okay? And because social media, there's also an illusion out there that everything that gets put on social media receives the same content or is always on social media. That is in fact not true. All right? Lots of things get cycled off of social media because there's so much content. The social media companies need to do that. Social media algorithms point to certain types of social media content over others, excluding others because of viral marketing. They want to feed you the content that they think you want based on what their algorithms and cookies are telling them, right? So not all content is posted to social media and stays on it. It's a myth. It does not. I mean, it's not. It's still, even despite you hear politicians talking about it being a wild west of information, actually, no, it's a highly controlled form of feeding information. And that's part of the problem, right, in terms of siloing and creating bubbles. Content is ranked by platform algorithms, thereby influencing what will be seen by users, at what rate, and so forth. There's no question about this, all right? These are clearly private decisions, largely dictated by commercial interests, but nevertheless are regulating content. The private companies are regulating content already, all right? While some groups in society, particularly on the far right of the political spectrum, have claimed this is an affront to free speech, the fact is that law and liberal democracies has not prevented it for decades, all right? We saw there are controls on free speech already in society, okay? There is, however, a relatively clear distinction drawn in the public mind between private regulation of speech, which is what I was just talking about, when newspapers regulate what they publish and social media regulates through algorithms what's seen and so on, and government regulation of speech, right? There's a in the public consciousness, there's a distinct difference between the two, right? In the case of private regulation, the public is more likely to say, well, they own it, and if you don't like it, don't use it, right? This position is entirely consistent with the view of freedom held by the vast majority of citizens in liberal democracies. On the other hand, government regulation of content lends itself to fears of attacks on rights and freedoms, and of course leaves ample room for partisan and media exaggeration and attacks against the enacting government, right? Excuse me. Regardless of political exaggeration, however, no democratic country, regardless of its government stability, can carelessly discount concerns about oppression, right? That's what makes government regulation of social media so difficult. The difficulty of it technically, the difficulty of it from selling it politically, the people's concerns about it, all of these things weigh into limiting what a government can realistically do, an elected government within a liberal democracy can realistically do to protect the people from the harms of social media. Although more and more public consciousness is lending credence to the fact that there has to be some regulation. But it's more likely that public sentiment will point to the private companies, the corporations themselves, the social media corporations themselves, and say, you must do more to clean up your act. The people feel much more comfortable with that approach than if a government steps in, sets up a regulatory agency or a regulatory program to regulate content on social media, right? Much more difficult. But we've seen that it doesn't have to be about content. Our government regulation can be set up that requires that the private companies themselves remove content that is clearly hateful, clearly based on disinformation and conspiracy theories, clearly propagating misinformation. Give them a certain amount of time to take it off their content. The people will feel more comfortable with that kind of approach rather than the government being the overseer of what is acceptable content or not, right? Because for government regulation, it raises serious questions. Who decides what content is acceptable and what is not, and based on what criteria? Right? Do you want the government doing that, or do you want the government basically defining disinformation, hate speech, and a few other things and saying, these are our definitions, and in this regulation, when you encounter things like this, social media corporation, you need to remove it by such and such a time? The people would be more comfortable with that approach, I believe, than if the government started setting up judges of speech, direct judges of speech. This is good, this isn't good. Very difficult for any liberal democratic government to ever take that approach, and for good reason. We understand the value of free speech, and we do understand the potential of harm that can arise from inappropriate regulation of speech, right? And how would government build the institutional capacity to carry out that task? It would be a huge task. We talked about the number of people on, the number of producers of content, the number of users of social media, the fact that it's a global infrastructure, not a national infrastructure. How would any one national government approach regulation in that way, in any case, right? Whether any government can effectively regulate social media platforms that by definition are gateways for contents around the world is a significant challenge, right? So it's more likely that what would happen is there would be more regulation that imposes that obligation on the social media corporations rather than dictating specifics by an individual government, okay? And let's give you some examples, because some of that has already began to happen, right? For an instance, Canada's federal government passed a law prior to the 2019 federal election regulating against foreign election interference via content on social media platforms. In other words, social media platforms needed to remove that material the minute it was discovered, if it impacted in any way on the Canadian federal election, okay? Notably, the government expressed a frustration, however, with lack of responsiveness of social media platforms. And that's because of the sheer volume, right, of this. And social media platforms who thrive on content are naturally reluctant to sort of start removing content without, careful consideration of their own strategic commercial interests. So presumably, if the government wanted to move further on this, it could, but it would have to bring in stricter penalties, right? But we're not going to get into that kind of detail. The federal government has indicated that options to control hate, misinformation, and disinformation on social media platforms are still being considered, despite the fact that the Prime Minister last year came out and said that we won't be regulating social media because it will set a bad example for authoritarian governments. But, how long that resistance will be there is an open question, because we have parliamentarians proposing private members' bills, we have lots of media pressure, we have lots of pressure from social groups to do something about social media. So how long a government will be able to continue to not regulate social media is a legitimate question from a politician's point of view. Okay, and it's only going to, we see it, right? We're living it right now. COVID-19, conspiracy theories, U.S. election conspiracy theories, you name it, right? Misinformation, disinformation, rising hate speech, all the indicators are up. So how long will a politician be able to withstand not doing something about this in the Canadian context is a legitimate question, all right? Germany is perhaps the country that has regulated social media platforms most forcefully, right? Fears of the reemergence of Nazism led them to that. Nazism obviously being the greatest example in recorded human history of the perils of hate speech, misinformation, and disinformation. There's no question about it. If you look at the history of Nazism in Germany, it was based largely on conspiracy theory campaigns, disinformation campaigns, and hate speech. I mean, it's well established in the historical record. So the NetzDG law in Germany to control hate speech came into effect in 2018. It applies to companies with more than 2 million registered users in the country. In other words, if you had a social media platform with more than 2 million people using it, you're subject to the law and to the associated regulations. Companies are required to set up procedures to review complaints about content they are hosting and remove anything that is clearly illegal within 24 hours. And they defined illegal by general concepts of what defines hate speech, what defines disinformation, what defines a conspiracy theory, and so on. Rather than the government kind of going, it's this, it's this, it's this, it's this, people can report finding something to the social media corporations and copy the government, and then the corporations will need to make a decision, in fact, of whether that is indicative of the definitions given by the law or not, and if it is, then it has to be taken off within 24 hours. Okay? But there are never going to be, a perfect straight line on this, right? One person's evil comment and is another person's, cause for deliberation, right? But key measures of what should be and should not be there are facts and truth, right? And individuals may be fined up to 5 million euros and companies up to 50 million euros for failing to comply with these requirements in a single case. So it can be quite punishing for social media corporations that allow these types of negative information sources to reside on their sites. Okay. The European Union also introduced the General Data Protection Regulation, setting requirements for the protection, storage, and use of data generated by social media users. This speaks to that big data privacy issue and how they can use big data. Their algorithms can use big data to create more funnels and more silos, right? Whereas the European Union is saying that not only are you profiting off that big data, you're using it to reinforce some of the negatives of social media in terms of the harm it can do to real free speech. And the EU is contemplating a directive that would place responsibility on social media companies to avoid copyright infringement, which is a less significant issue, but it just goes to show you they're taking a commercial approach to the regulation of social media. Finally, Australia and New Zealand have passed laws restricting the sharing of abhorrent material on social media platforms, involving fines and possible jail sentences for executives. These are but a few examples of the types of steps being taken by democratic governments to address harms associated with social media. Okay? However, the vast majority of decisions and activities to regulate social media content reside in private hands, including those by social media corporations and individual social media users. All right. So let's look at private regulation, which, as you can see, the types of regulations that governments are bringing in are basically trying to reinforce the strength of private regulation, aren't they? They're not going out there and saying, that's inappropriate speech, that isn't, that is, that isn't. They're not doing that. They're saying, here are some definitions of what we don't want our people to be exposed to. Now it's up to you private corporations through a commercial regulation to take it off in a certain period of time. So the private regulation that's already occurring within social media corporations are given more impetus, more legal credence by governments rather than governments displacing the private regulation that is already occurring in social media corporations. Okay. Social media corporations have come under increasing pressure across democratic countries to do a better job self-regulating hate, misinformation, and disinformation. Government regulatory pressures intensify when self-government is deemed to be too lax or too slow, right? And that's what I mean. Most government regulations are reinforcing the private discipline or the private regulatory, self-regulatory activity through regulation rather than trying to displace it, all right? And that's because of what the reasons I've talked about. Liberal democratic governments are reticent to become the dictators of specific speech, right? For the reasons we've discussed, liberal democracy, right? Private regulation of content is taken on a massive scale, in fact, right? YouTube, for example, employs over 10,000 moderators to monitor and remove content and to refine self-governance policy based on lessons learned. The company claims that 7.8 million videos were removed from the platform between July and September of 2018 alone. 7.8 million, right? In basically 4 months. Okay? So the sheer volume of hatefulness, the sheer volume of disinformation and conspiracy theories, that just gives you one indication. That's just YouTube, right? I mean, it's not an insignificant issue, okay? It's not consistent with free speech, all right? And so you can be a strong advocate of free speech and still be a strong advocate for responsible use of social media. Facebook has similarly invested heavily in moderating content with an estimated 15,000 moderators contracted by the company to assess content flagged for racism, conspiracy theories, and violence. Right? And there's been some really interesting stories coming out by these contracted moderators of people, suffering from PTSD and other quite harmful medical conditions because of the sheer ugliness of what they see when they try to take this off social media. Okay? Facebook claims that between July and September of 2019, it took action against 11.6 million posts depicting child sexual exploitation, 7 million for promoting hate speech, 3.2 million for bullying or harassment violations, and 5.2 million for sharing terrorist propaganda. And they're still under criticism because too much of this violent and this nasty content escapes and stays on social media. Okay? Facebook claims that in the same period, 754,000 posts depicting child exploitation and 133,000 posts for violating its policies against terrorist content were pulled off of Instagram. Okay, so we are talking abuses of a massive scale, not minor issues. All right, so finding a balance between valuing free speech and seeing that it prospers and it continues to flourish, and this nastiness, it's a very increasingly important issue for society. Social media companies implement self-regulation via the work of moderators and automated self-learning technology. They use a lot of bots too, and AI, right? That automatically identifies and flags sites based on, keywords, picture visuals that AI computers can pick up and automatically flag these sites when then they're subsequently reviewed by a human moderator and pulled off the site if necessary. Because despite all these resources, the social media companies continues to struggle to keep up with the sheer volume of content that is hate speech, morally abhorrent misinformation, and disinformation. There's no question about it, right? And for this reason, many observers argue that the best and last defense against this content resides in other private actions, namely media literacy educations for social media users. Okay? Media literacy is much of what we covered in this course generally, didn't we? Right? And we have to take our own responsibility. So, yes, we need to do something. I think government will need to do something. Social media corporations will need to, experience more pressure to do better job. The question then becomes, is that enough? And I would argue it's certainly not. Because the sheer volume of what's on social media, there has to be individual social media user education and personal responsibility. And that's mostly of what we've talked about in this course, isn't it? It's a discussion of free speech and the challenge of social media, but it's developing a sort of ability to understand what these issues are, not seeing them as either or. You can be a strong advocate of free speech while being also a strong advocate of responsible speech, right? You can, be a person who takes their own personal responsibility for their social media use. But that requires education, that requires awareness, and that's what we've tried to accomplish in this course. And I think you guys have done a very good job of coming along with these messages. And many of you, because you're the age you are and you grew up as the social media generation, you also understand things about social media that maybe other people don't understand, or young people need to be alerted to the harms that social media can cause before they become sophisticated enough to understand social media. Older people need to become educated because they did not grow up with social media. So there's no question that social media literacy is a vitally important activity that education institutions can take up. All right, to do their part to address these harms that social media information, inappropriate social media information can generate. Okay, and in the age of social media, and social media isn't going anywhere. Okay, despite what people say about breaking up companies and so on, you're not turning back the clock on social media. Okay, social media is going to be with us. Free speech should very much be with us. The question then becomes, what does ensuring that what we're really getting on social media is free speech, positive free speech, right? Free speech with eudaimonic value to society, How do we, not one line of argument. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying one line of argument. I said that, 10 people can look at the same body of facts and come up with 10 slightly different interpretations of those facts. And that's perfectly legitimate. And that's what the marketplace of ideas is about. Trying to reach a consensus of what those facts really say. Well, I didn't see it that way, but no harm done. Yeah, okay, I can see why you see it that way. Okay, let's compromise. That's perfectly legitimate because it's based on facts. It's based on truth. It's the stuff that isn't that we're after. All right. On that score, gang, I want to wish you the best for your when we go to our final exam, for your last YouTube video of the term, and hopefully we'll see you again sometime soon. All right, bye bye for now. Take care of yourselves.